The Brewster Buffalo slammed into the grass airfield and exploded into a ground loop. Metal shrieked. The tail wheel unlocked exactly as squadron leader Walter Churchill had ordered, sending the fighters spinning across the field like a broken toy. From the operations room window, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory watched the American pilot climb from the cockpit, unhurt but visibly shaken. It was the third Buffalo to crash that week, the third American pilot to survive what should have been a routine landing. Leigh-Mallory turned to his aide with the expression of a man watching a prediction come true. "Completely undisciplined," he said. "Every last one of them." On that autumn day, the 1st Eagle Squadron, number 71, officially formed as part of RAF Fighter Command. 6 American volunteers who had fought in the Battle of Britain were joined by dozens more who had crossed the Atlantic illegally, violating U.S. neutrality acts to reach England. Eugene "Red" Tobin, Andrew Mamedoff, and Vernon "Shorty" Keogh, the 3 original Eagles who had flown Hurricanes with 609 Squadron during Britain's darkest hour, now found themselves leading men who had never seen combat. The Americans had come for adventure, for high-performance fighters, for a war their country refused to join. What they received was skepticism wrapped in British courtesy and doubt delivered with impeccable accents. Leigh-Mallory, commander of No. 12 Group responsible for defending southeastern England, had been straightforward in his opposition to an American squadron. He remembered Americans from the Royal Flying Corps in World War I. Individual charm, yes. Collective discipline, no? His colleagues throughout Fighter Command shared his assessment. Americans might make adequate pilots in peacetime. In war, against the Luftwaffe, they would be liabilities. The mathematical argument seemed irrefutable. The RAF had survived the Battle of Britain through discipline, coordination, and adherence to tactical doctrine. Fighter Command had evolved into a precisely calibrated defensive system. American volunteers, no matter how enthusiastic, represented chaos injected into order. Yet Charles Sweeney, the wealthy American businessman who had recruited and funded these pilots, had convinced the Air Ministry to take the risk. His argument was political, not military. 3 Eagle Squadrons would demonstrate American commitment to Britain's survival. When the United States inevitably entered the war, these veterans would provide invaluable experience. The British government agreed. RAF Fighter Command accepted, and 244 American volunteers would spend the next 2 years proving everyone wrong. The winter of 1941 brought bitter cold to RAF Martlesham Heath in Suffolk, where 71 Squadron waited for permission to prove themselves in combat. The Buffalo fighters were gone, deliberately destroyed through Churchill's sabotage by instruction. In their place sat Hawker Hurricanes, battle-tested aircraft that had helped win the Battle of Britain. Yet 71 Squadron remained grounded, cycling through endless training missions while other squadrons flew combat operations over the Channel. In London, Sir Sholto Douglas, the new chief of Fighter Command, reviewed reports on the American squadron with increasing frustration. For months since formation, 0 combat missions, multiple training accidents, discipline problems that made Leigh-Mallory's warnings seem prophetic. Douglas drafted a memo to General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Corps, who was visiting Britain on a fact-finding mission. The language was diplomatic, but the meaning clear. 71 Squadron's performance was unsatisfactory. Disbanding the unit and returning the pilots to America remained a possibility. For the Americans at Martlesham Heath, the threat was existential. They had crossed the Atlantic illegally, forfeited their U.S. citizenship, and risked imprisonment to reach England. Now the British were considering sending them home as failures before they had fired a shot in combat. Squadron leader William Taylor, the American commander, pleaded with the Air Ministry. His pilots were ready. They had trained longer than standard RAF squadrons. They understood their aircraft. They needed one chance to prove themselves. On February 5, 1941, 71 Squadron was declared operational. Their assignment, coastal convoy patrols. The least glamorous duty in Fighter Command, watching over merchant ships in the North Sea where German fighters rarely appeared. It was a test, though nobody stated it explicitly. Prove you can fly formation, maintain discipline, and perhaps you will see real combat. The Americans flew their patrols without incident. No enemy contact. No heroics. Just hour after hour of formation flying over gray water, learning to work as a unit rather than as individuals. By April, patience exhausted, the squadron moved to Martlesham Heath in Suffolk as part of 11 Group, Fighter Command's most active sector. Hurricane Mark IIs replaced their Mark Is. The new aircraft featured Rolls-Royce Merlin XX engines with improved performance, though they still could not match the Messerschmitt Bf 109F that German fighter units now flew over France. The real test came on May 15, 1941. 11,000 feet above the English Channel on May 15, 1941, two Hurricane fighters from 71 Squadron banked south toward the French coast on their first real combat patrol. Two 71 Squadron Hurricanes, on fighter sweep south of Boulogne, encountered three Messerschmitt Bf 109s at 15,000 feet. The Germans held altitude advantage and dove to attack, their 20mm cannon and machine guns opening fire at 400 yards. The Americans turned to engage. In the confused dogfight that followed, one Bf 109 took hits and dove away trailing smoke, damaged but not destroyed. One Hurricane absorbed cannon strikes to the wing, hit not by German fire, but by bullets from the other American aircraft. Both Hurricanes returned to base. The damaged Bf 109 was recorded as a probable. The friendly fire incident was noted in the after-action report with British understatement. First combat. No confirmed victories. One aircraft damaged by fratricidal fire. The skeptics in Fighter Command found their predictions confirmed. Yet something had changed. The Americans had engaged enemy fighters and survived. The Hurricanes, despite inferior performance, had gotten close enough to damage a Bf 109. No one had panicked. No one had run. It was not success. But it was not failure either. The Eagles had one more chance. The industrial city of Lille sprawled beneath scattered clouds on July 21, 1941, as pilot officer William Dunn circled at 12,000 feet, watching British bombers begin their attack run below. Pilot officer William Dunn, a cowboy from Montana who had tried and failed to join the U.S. Army Air Corps, spotted the Messerschmitt Bf 109F below his Hurricane at 12,000 feet. The German fighter was climbing to intercept a formation of British bombers, unaware of the American diving from above. Dunn had learned patience from his combat-experienced squadron mates, Tobin, Keogh, and Maimdoff. Get close. Conserve ammunition. Fire only when you cannot miss. At 200 yards, Dunn opened fire. The Hurricane's 8.303 machine guns sent 160 rounds per second converging on the Messerschmitt. Strikes walked across the fuselage. The canopy shattered. Black smoke erupted from the engine cowling. The Bf 109F rolled inverted and dove vertically toward the French countryside, the pilot either dead or unconscious at the controls. Dunn followed until the German fighter struck the ground near Lille in a mushroom of fire and debris. 71 Squadron's first confirmed victory. The first aerial kill by an American pilot in U.S. military history, though Dunn wore RAF blue and flew under British command. The kill was recorded, verified, and reported up the chain of command. In London, Sir Sholto Douglas read the combat report with the first stirrings of reconsideration. August brought Supermarine Spitfire Mark versus to replace the squadron's Hurricanes. The sleek fighters with their elliptical wings and Merlin 45 engines represented the RAF's finest equipment. Americans who had been flying cast-off aircraft now flew the same machines as the most elite British squadrons. With the Spitfires came offensive operations. Fighter sweeps over northern France, hunting German fighters over their own territory. Bomber escort missions deep into occupied Europe. The Americans flew 5, 6, 7 missions weekly, and they began to kill. August, 3 confirmed victories. September, 5 confirmed. The numbers climbed as the Americans learned their craft through blood and repetition. But combat extracted its price in a currency no training could prepare them for. September 7, 1941 dawned clear over the French coast near Boulogne. Perfect weather for a fighter sweep that would cost 71 Squadron one of its founding members. Flying Officer Eugene "Red" Tobin, one of the 3 original Eagles who had fought in the Battle of Britain, led his section on a fighter sweep over the French coast. He was 24 years old, from Los Angeles, and had been fighting Germans since July 1940 when most Americans were still reading about the war in newspapers. The bounce came from above and behind. 6 Bf 109s diving through scattered clouds. Tobin broke hard left, calling the attack over the radio, but the Germans had positioned perfectly. One Bf-109 pilot, likely a veteran ace, tracked Tobin's turn and fired a deflection burst that struck the Spitfire's engine and cockpit. The Spitfire fell away trailing fire and glycol smoke. No parachute appeared. Tobin went down with his aircraft, killed instantly by cannon shells or dead before his fighter struck the channel. His body was never recovered. The funeral at the American church in London 3 days later was attended by American and British officers, American civilians living in England, and reporters who had begun following the Eagle Squadron story. Tobin was the first Eagle to die in combat, but he would not be the last. His death accomplished what months of training and British criticism had failed to achieve. The surviving Americans understood, finally, that this was not adventure. This was war. And war killed even the best pilots, even the most experienced, even those who had survived 100 missions. The cockiness that had so annoyed Lee Mallory evaporated. In its place came focus, discipline born not from regulations, but from the knowledge that mistakes meant death. October 1941 would prove whether the transformation was real. At RAF Curtin and Lindsay, north of Lincoln in the English countryside, October 1941 brought the moment that would silence every critic who had doubted the Americans. The operations board in the dispersal hut tracked squadron performance across fighter command. It was updated daily, a brutal accounting of aerial victories that every pilot studied obsessively. By mid-October, one squadron stood at the top, number 71. 9 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single month. More than any other squadron in fighter command. The Americans, flying Spitfire Mark vs., had become the most lethal unit in the entire RAF. The combat reports told the story in clinical language. October 7th, 2 Bf-109 destroyed over Streetomer. October 14th, 1 FW-190 destroyed, 1 damaged over Lille. October 21st, 3 Bf-109s destroyed during bomber escort. October 28th, 2 Bf-109s destroyed during fighter sweep. Squadron leader Stanley Mears, the British commander who had replaced Walter Churchill, led from the front with skill that won American respect. The Eagles followed his tactical leadership while bringing their own aggressive spirit to combat. The combination proved devastating. In London, Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory, the same officer who had opposed the squadron's formation, now cited 71 Squadron as an example of fighter command's offensive success. Sir Sholto Douglas, who had threatened to disband the unit 9 months earlier, sent congratulations. The mathematics had shifted. The Americans had proven themselves not through political arguments or promises, but through the only currency fighter command valued: confirmed kills against the Luftwaffe. November brought tragedy again. Squadron leader Mears and pilot Ross Scarborough collided during a training flight, both killed instantly. The loss of their commander could have shattered the squadron's morale. Instead, it strengthened their resolve. By the end of 1941, 3 Eagle Squadrons were operational. Number 121 formed in May, number 133 in August. Combined, the 3 American squadrons claimed 45 confirmed victories, 15 probables, and 24 aircraft damaged. The RAF could no longer dismiss them as undisciplined cowboys. They had become warriors. As spring returned to England in 1942, fighter command strategy shifted decisively from defense to offense, and the Eagle Squadrons moved with it. Fighter command's transition from defense to offense accelerated through 1942. Large-scale sweeps over France, bomber escorts to targets across occupied Europe, strafing attacks on German airfields, and transportation. The 3 Eagle Squadrons flew alongside veteran British units, no longer marked by their nationality, but by their capability. The Americans had learned to fly tight formation, to coordinate attacks, to follow tactical doctrine while maintaining the initiative in combat. They flew Spitfire Mark vs. and later the Mark 9, aircraft that could match or exceed anything the Luftwaffe fielded except the new Focke-Wulf FW-190 radial engine fighter. April 1942 brought intense activity. Number 71 Squadron flew 661 missions in a single month. On April 27th, during a bomber escort over Streetomer, American Squadron Commander Chesley Peterson destroyed 2 enemy aircraft, while other squadron members claimed 3 more. Peterson, at 23 years old, had had become the youngest squadron commander in the RAF. His rise symbolized the complete integration of Americans into Fighter Command's leadership structure. Dawn broke over the English Channel on August 19, 1942, revealing an armada of ships carrying 6,000 Allied troops toward the French coastal city of Dieppe in what would become one of the war's bloodiest raids. Operation Jubilee, the Allied raid on the French coastal city of Dieppe, brought together all three Eagle Squadrons in combat for the first and only time under RAF command. 24 RAF fighter squadrons provided air cover for the amphibious assault. 3 were Eagles. The Dieppe raid proved catastrophic on the ground, with landing forces suffering devastating casualties. But in the air, the Eagles found their finest hour. Numbers 71, 121, and 133 squadrons claimed 9 enemy aircraft destroyed and 4 probables. They lost 6 Spitfires with 1 pilot taken prisoner and 1 killed. Against overwhelming German numbers, the Americans had fought with skill and courage that matched the RAF's best. It was their peak. 3 weeks later would come their nadir. 3 weeks after Dieppe's triumph, September 26, 1942 brought the kind of weather that kills pilots as efficiently as enemy fighters. Heavy clouds stacked from sea level to 15,000 feet over the French coast. Number 133 Squadron, flying brand-new Spitfire Mark IXs, escorted USAF Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses attacking targets near Morlaix. Heavy clouds obscured the French coast. Strong winds, stronger than forecasted, pushed the formation south of their intended track. The squadron let down through the clouds to get below the weather and establish their position. They emerged directly over Brest, one of the most heavily defended German naval bases in France. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from dozens of gun positions. German fighters scrambled from nearby airfields. 11 of 12 Spitfires were shot down or crashed attempting to reach England on failing fuel. 6 pilots were taken prisoner. 4 were killed. 1 evaded capture. 1 crash-landed in England, his Spitfire a bullet-riddled wreck. In a single mission, 133 squadrons ceased to exist as an effective combat unit. The disaster dominated British newspapers. Questions were asked in Parliament. The Air Ministry launched investigations. German propaganda broadcast gleefully about the American losses. For the Eagles, Morlaix served as a brutal reminder. Skill and courage could not overcome poor weather, navigation errors, and bad luck. The war remained as dangerous in September 1942 as it had been in May 1941, when William Dunn scored their first victory. 3 days later, on September 29, 1942, the parade ground at RAF Debden in Essex filled with American and British officers assembled to witness the end of an experiment that had exceeded everyone's expectations. The 3 Eagle Squadrons assembled for their final formation as RAF units. They wore British blue for the last time, standing at attention on the parade ground while American and British generals delivered speeches about valor, sacrifice, and alliance. Among the officers present were Major General Carl Spaatz, commander of the 8th Air Force, and Air Chief Marshal Sir Sholto Douglas, chief of RAF Fighter Command. Douglas spoke with genuine emotion about pilots who had answered Britain's call when America remained neutral. He thanked them for their service, praised their courage, and expressed regret at their departure. The irony was not lost on the Eagles. Douglas, the same officer who had called their performance unsatisfactory 20 months earlier, now lauded them as exemplars of Anglo-American cooperation. But the transformation was real. The Americans had proven themselves through the only test that mattered in war: sustained combat against a skilled enemy. On September 29, 1942, the 3 Eagle Squadrons officially transferred to the U.S. Army Air Forces. Numbers 71, 121, and 133 became the 334th, 335th, and 336th Fighter Squadrons of the 4th Fighter Group, 8th Air Force. They continued flying from Debden, now in American khaki instead of British blue. The Spitfires remained, though by 1943 they would transition to Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and then North American P-51 Mustangs. The record they established during their RAF service told its own story: 73.5 enemy aircraft destroyed, countless others damaged, 71 Americans killed out of 244 who served. a mortality rate of 29% that made the Eagles one of the most dangerous units in which to serve. But their legacy extended beyond the numbers. The final accounting came 3 years later when the war ended in Europe and statisticians tallied what the Eagles had accomplished under both British and American command. By war's end in 1945, the 4th Fighter Group had become the highest-scoring Allied fighter group in the European theater. Their final tally stood at 1,052 one-half enemy aircraft destroyed, including 583.5 in aerial combat and 469 destroyed on the ground. They had beaten every other American group, including the legendary 56th Fighter Group that claimed 985 total victories. The foundation for this success was laid during those early months with the RAF when American cowboys learned to become disciplined warriors. And when the British finally acknowledged their worth, the Americans had already learned the hardest lesson of all, that respect is earned in combat, never given in speeches, and paid for in the blood of friends who will never come home. The Eagle Squadrons defended British skies with fury born from desperation to prove themselves. They succeeded because they were willing to die trying. 71 of them did. The rest became the warriors their British doubters never imagined they could be.